everyone, it's Laura. So in this lecture I want to explore madness, mental distress and inequality. And in particular I want us to just think about some of the ways that other parts of our lives, or the characteristics that we might have as humans, intersect with madness and mental distress. Okay, so who do you think is more likely to be diagnosed with depression? Someone who is poor or someone who is wealthy? Have a think for a moment. Okay, so poverty then is one of the leading causes of people feeling depressed, experiencing anxiety. And if we think about what helps us develop resilience as we grow up, we've got particular protective factors, and people generally who live in poverty are more likely to be those who have grown up with less protective factors and therefore less able to or less resilient to particular types of adversity and hardship. So protective factors then are things like strong relationships with friends and family, having wider connections within the community, so members of something, members of a church or members of a gym, etc. Also ideas around having self-control, so a belief that you are someone who is able to influence things. These are all things that can be often found in people who live in poverty. Similarly, if we think about some of the things that may help ease distress, for example, again, people living in poverty are less likely to have things like, the opportunity to have a holiday, to pack up your stuff and drive down to the beach, to have a massage, to go to an exercise class, things like transport, babysit and entrance costs. They all cost a lot of money, and therefore people who live in poorer circumstances often don't have access to the things that might help us to either relieve distress or stop it materialising in the first place. Okay, now let's think about schizophrenia then. Do you think people with schizophrenia are more likely to be people who are poorer or people who are wealthier? Okay, so again, people who live in poorer circumstances are more likely to be given a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And what's really important to recognise about this fact is that schizophrenia is typically framed as a biological disorder, due to brain chemical imbalances, etc. But we know that we still don't understand why people might experience visual or auditory hallucinations or be delusional. And this is a good example to kind of prove that, if you like, because if it was a genuine biological, if there was something biological going on to cause it, then it wouldn't discriminate between whether you were someone that had some wealth or someone who lived in poverty. It would be seen across, all social classes, etc. But it's not. It's much more likely to be diagnosed in someone who lives in poverty. So that brings a real challenge to some of the medicalised ways in which people think about this thing we call schizophrenia. And there's a number of different kind of theories about the high incidence of diagnosis amongst people who live in poorer circumstances. And it's something that the connection between poverty and mental distress has been researched a lot. Some people make the argument for something that's referred to as drift theory, so that mental distress causes people to have a downward shift into poverty. Yeah, so it causes mental distress or madness causes people to lose their job, to not own their own home, etc. But then you've also got what also might get referred to as the social causation theory, so that actually it is your environment itself that causes the distress. Yeah, poverty is what causes distress. And interestingly, one might think that unemployment is something that is likely to cause the most mental distress, but actually it's people in low paid and unstable jobs. So if we think hear about people who have poor working conditions, people who are in jobs that are not valued, where they're not valued, that what they do isn't valued, that is low paid. It might be that people have to do more than one job because it's so badly paid. People not having security. This is something that has got increasingly bad in society now. People on 0 hours contracts, people who have to work extremely long hours, and also jobs where you have very little control about the way in which you do your job. So if I think about my job, I have an awful lot of say in the way in which I go about how I manage my time, etc., etc. I have quite a lot of control. Obviously, there are things that I have to do, but I have quite a lot of control in doing those. So people who have more poorer work conditions are much more likely to experience mental distress. Okay, let's just have a think about ethnicity then. So who's more likely to be diagnosed with depression, a black woman or a white woman? What do you think? Okay, so it would be a black woman. And this would firstly be because of some of the things that I've already looked at. So, for example, women of colour are much more likely to be in lower paid work, but it's actually also linked to the experiences of racism. And remember, when we're thinking about racism, we're not just talking about the experience of adverse racist abuse, but institutional racism, where white people are privileged over people of colour. Okay, the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Who's more likely to get that diagnosis, a black man or a white man? Okay, so it's men of colour are more likely to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And in particular, there is a much higher prevalence of men of colour being diagnosed with conditions that sometimes get referred to as psychotic disorders, so things like schizophrenia, for example. And it's particularly prevalent in the case of men of Black Caribbean heritage in the UK. In fact, some research suggests that they are twice as likely as a white man to be diagnosed as having something like schizophrenia. And interestingly as well, research has also highlighted that staff who work in psychiatric services, including psychiatrists themselves, are more likely to perceive black patients as being potentially dangerous, despite the fact that there's no evidence that they are more aggressive than anyone else in the psychiatric system. So there still remains some serious issues with the way in which black men are perceived. Okay, thinking about suicide then. This is cheery, isn't it? So who would be more likely to commit suicide? A black man or a white man? So it's actually white men. I think there's much more, we've learnt much more about suicide. There's been a lot more in the media talking about it. But in 2018, there was 6,507 suicides that were registered. I couldn't get the 2019 stats just yet. And actually, in the four different parts that make up the UK, Northern Ireland actually has the highest rates. And interestingly as well, not only did they have the highest rates, but they had the highest rates for younger men. So age in Northern Ireland, there's a tendency for young men to be the age of 25 and 29, which is young indeed. Whereas in England, for example, it's more likely to be between 45 and 49. Wales is 40 to 44. And Scotland 35 to 44. Okay, so who might be more likely to commit suicide? A young woman of Asian descent or a young white woman? So research tells us then that young Asian women are 3 times as likely to actually kill themselves than young white women. But still within the UK, white men, there's much more higher statistics for white men taking their own life. So research has also revealed then that people of colour are more likely than white people to be given physical treatment, so medication, electroconvulsive therapy. They are likely to be prescribed higher doses of medication. They're less likely to be offered psychotherapy, more talking treatments, counselling, and other non-medical interventions. So some worrying evidence really of the kind of continued racism, if you like, that's inherent within the psychiatric system. Okay, so let's think about gender now. So depression. Are men or women more likely to get a diagnosis of depression? Well, no surprise, it's women. And research says that even though a man and a woman might go into a GP surgery, and on the some of you may have experienced the like the questionnaire, like the inventory that they do in diagnosing depression, even though someone might score exactly the same, a doctor is much more likely to give the diagnosis of depression to a woman, even though they've got the same score as a man on that inventory. How about obsessive compulsive disorder? Yep, well that one too is women, and I'll think a little bit more about that in a second. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. Usually when I do this in a lecture theatre, most people say men. And most people usually say men because they think about post-traumatic stress disorder as relating to people who have been in the armed forces. But actually post-traumatic stress disorder is most commonly seen in women, largely because of gender-based violence. But on top of gender-based violence, just the kind of socioeconomic disadvantage that women experience, whether that be low pay or, a lack of equality in terms of income, their social status, and then on top of that, often unremitting responsibility for the care of others. So You tend to see, whereas you'll often find that some of the disorders I mentioned before, um, the idea of kind of psychotic disorders that get planted on people, you can often find those in men, but some of those that are often attached to emotions are much more likely to be seen in women. And you see this all the time in terms of, things like anxiety, things like obsessive compulsive disorder, um, those things, because there are all sorts of ideas around women and emotion. I'm just showing a rather amusing advert that was in a newspaper. I don't have a date for it actually, but it says it's called. The heading is "These Hysterical Women," and it's a classic kind of looks like something from a black and white film. A woman looking very distressed. She's holding her kind of fists to the sides of her head, and underneath the text says, "Crying, sobbing, laughing. Has she no control of herself? The slightest thing drives her to distraction. Tired all the time, overwrought, nerves strung to the breaking point, she tries to do her work. Constant headaches, backache, and dizzy spells are robbing this woman of youth, beauty, and health. How pitiful is to see her suffering, and how unnecessary." And essentially, it's suggesting that that if we were to take Lydia E. Pinkham's vegetable compound, then this tonic would help this woman be less distressed. But we have lots of, if we look back in terms of like films, I can think of old films that I used to watch, with a hysterical woman in it, where it takes a man to slap her around the face and bring her out of her hysteria and stuff. There's something that's really worrying about the way in which, because emotion is often, and anyone who expresses emotion quite publicly and easily, as I am. In fact, I have been told once by a male colleague here that they didn't particularly find it easy being in meetings with me because I was over emotional. And it's this idea that somehow that we don't have self-control, and this links a lot with all sorts of again, if you're thinking about women moving up the ranks in terms of their careers and things like that. People don't think that someone who's very openly emotional and passionate, etc., has got any real kind of control. And this often makes people think that this isn't someone who would make a good chief exec. A man in a suit is much more a much safer pair of hands, if you like. So there's lots. I mean, I could go on about this, but it's still seen, even again within medicine. So as I say, then the ways in which we will get treated in the psychiatric system really varies as well, in terms of what we might get diagnosed with, for example. So I'll leave it there, and I would like you to just reflect back on the slide. So go back through the slide, think about which one surprised you and why you might have been surprised. In addition, if you could think about other reasons behind the statistics. For example, why women might be more likely to be diagnosed with depression than men. Why is that? See if you can make notes and think about reasons why that might be. And finally, think about the ways in which things like gender, ethnicity, age, class, and mental distress intersect with each other. Yeah, in a way I've kind of oversimplified in order to just reveal to you some of the inequalities that people based on based on the on being poor or being of color or of being a woman in a way by taking those as separate entities as slightly kind of oversimplified people's experiences, but so what I want you to do is to then think about how they might then intersect with one another. So, what would it mean to be a poorer woman of colour? Yeah, or a young male of colour. Think about the ways in which they might intersect. Okay, lovies, see you soon.